So there's this trend on YouTube that's been bothering me for a little while now, and so I thought I'd finally talk about it. And it's the trend that every month or so, a new channel will pop up with a video that is essentially exactly the same. And it's a video that is anti-power scaling. They pretty much all follow the same premise and usually have even a pretty similar title. And it's just that power scaling is dumb, power scaling is stupid, power scaling is cringe, I don't like power scaling, something like that. And the video goes on for about 10 minutes going over why the person doesn't like power scaling and why they find it stupid or dumb or whatever they want to call it. And these videos have been bothering me for a while for pretty obvious reasons. Firstly, I'm a power scaling YouTube channel. It's kind of what I love to do. It's kind of how I make my living right now. So when I see these videos that are kind of the antithesis of what I do, I feel like I should say something about it and kind of address the arguments generally. Now, in this video, I'm not going to be specifically responding to any one person's video that have made this kind of thing. I don't think that's very constructive. I kind of want to address all the points I've heard, or at least the biggest points that I've heard, and kind of go over why I either don't think they're valid or kind of coming from the wrong place. At the end, I'll also go over, and throughout this video, I'll go over why I actually think power scaling is incredibly necessary for fiction, and I think a lot of people don't understand actually what power scaling is for the most part. But I will also have some criticisms for the power scaling community, so let's just jump right in. So the number one biggest single kind of issue or, epic debunk to the existence of power scaling is the notion that either the author doesn't think about power scaling or that the author doesn't write from a power scaling perspective. And partially this is true, but is also objectively untrue. Now, what I think they are correct about is that the author is not looking through their series from a primarily power scaling centered view, which means that they're not considering scenes from a power scaling perspective first. They're usually coming at it from a character standpoint, a narrative event kind of standpoint. But inherently, from character and narrative and the sequencing of events, power scaling is, unfortunately, for some at least, a naturally occurring event. See, stories have these things called stakes and character progression. Both of these things inherently or usually involve imbalances of power, either because the protagonist grows in some way through their journey, and a lot of times that is through literal physical strength, at least in things like shonen manga, the number one focus of power scaling, or, an example of stakes, there is something that has more power than something else, and it must either be stopped or put an end to. Now, it doesn't have to necessarily be power. Sometimes it could be, oh, this guy has a weapon that we can't stop, or this guy has an army that is too powerful to defeat by ourselves. But both of those instances, that still, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, is power scaling. Because at the end of the day, power scaling, in the most basic sense, is just A is over B. That's it. You've power scaled when you've done that. Now, there are technically two kinds of power scaling, and it seems that people have issues with both. There is both the inverse power scaling, where you say the person in this story is stronger than this other person in the story. For example, Goku versus Vegeta. You would say Goku has beaten Broly, for example, and Vegeta can't beat Broly, so Goku beats Vegeta. That's inverse power scaling. Then there's crossverse scaling, where you take two characters from different stories and you say, well, this guy made a big explosion that is bigger than any explosion this guy has made, so he's stronger. Again, for an example, Goku versus Superman. Now, the interesting thing is that you can do cross-verse scaling from just an inverse perspective, essentially saying how strong is character A and just leaving it in a vacuum, not saying therefore he is stronger than character B. And I think both of these things, both at least inverse power scaling and then internal cross-verse power scaling, are absolutely things that are being considered, at least to a degree, by the author. And in fact, a lot of stories just fundamentally wouldn't work. Again, I'm going to be using a lot of shonen for an example, but a lot of shonen stories simply would not work if they didn't have power scaling considered. Just for a couple examples, I'm not actually going to start with a Dragonball example just to show you guys that I've read other stories. So one of the things that immediately comes to mind are especially the stuff in the later parts of Naruto. There are some major plot points in Naruto that only work because a character is strong enough to blow up a certain thing. If they're not able to do that, the entire kind of part of that story no longer functions. For example of this, Pain destroying the Leaf Village. This is a moment that is supposed to absolutely shock and terrify the reader, and it creates a super big catharsis for the reader when, at the end of the fight between Naruto versus Pain, Pain undoes most of the damage that he causes by bringing everybody back, and then there's that whole period where they're rebuilding the Leaf Village. That doesn't work if Pain isn't cross-verse strong enough to destroy the Leaf Village. Another example, though, is the Ten Tails actually able to shoot those giant, essentially nuclear bombs halfway across the world to destroy different parts of the Ninja Alliance that aren't even on the battlefield. That's a major plot point in the war arc, and again, it doesn't work unless that guy can shoot that blast that far or that hard. Again, power scaling. Even internal power scaling, this exists in Naruto. The entire dynamic of Naruto and Sasuke continuously surpassing and matching and getting new abilities to be stronger than the other doesn't really work if power scaling isn't being considered. For example, if power scaling wasn't being thought of by the author in any single way, then why doesn't Chapter 1 Sasuke just kill Itachi and get revenge? It literally just doesn't work that way. It is being considered whether you like it or not. Of course, Dragon Ball has probably the most examples about this, and this is probably why I'm pretty open to the notion of power scaling. I think a lot of people are kind of informed on their notions of power scaling based on their favorite series, so I think like Naruto fans see power scaling kind of from a more of a Naruto perspective, or Jujutsu Kaisen fans see it from more of a Jujutsu Kaisen perspective, on and on and on. And because Dragon Ball is the primary series that I talk about and consume, I see power scaling, I think, from a maybe more basic perspective than a lot of people, and I kind of just look at the simple facts and the simple things that we are shown and blah 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 blah. For a Dragon Ball example, you have Frieza on Namek. Frieza being able to destroy Namek is like the most important thing about that final battle between Goku and Frieza on Namek. The entire kind of ending of thinking Goku dies, Goku just barely escaping, doesn't work unless Frieza can do that. Toriyama absolutely considered the fact that Frieza can destroy planets. We see him do it in other parts, and even weaker characters can destroy planets. It kind of is what makes Frieza so impressive and so terrifying, that he's that much further beyond these guys who could already destroy planets. Isn't that crazy? Like, to say that Toriyama didn't think of this, I think, is just entirely reductive about who he was as an author. Another inverse example, if you just want to be as blatant as you can be, is the fact that Gojo is the strongest. If Gojo isn't the strongest in his story, then Gojo's story as a character no longer makes sense. Power scaling is inherent to Gojo's character, that his A is greater than someone else's B. You can't really deny this fact, or Gojo's character no longer exists in the exact same way. Now, the number one kind of point kind of against this that I see people use is the interview with Dan Lee like 10 years ago, where he says that the person who wins in a fight is whoever the author decides wins. And I think the only people who see this as a debunk to power scaling are the people who aren't power scalers, but fundamentally from day one, that's the entire point of at least inverse power scaling, is figuring out who the author, at least implied the most, is the guy who is going to win that fight if they didn't give an exact answer. Take the famous example of Kakuzu versus Pain from Naruto. That debate only exists because Kishimoto never looked at us and said, hey, Pain 100%, no doubt, beats Kakuzu. So instead, people look to evidence in the story to say who wins. Either way, we're trying to answer that question because it is true. The winner of a fight is who the author determines. Now, specifically for comics, the example I believe he uses is Spider-Man versus the Thing. The fact is that sometimes Spider-Man can be stronger than the Thing. Powers fluctuate all the time in comics. It's not a debunk to power scaling. It shows that power scaling is alive and well, and that sometimes power scaling changes in the story, and that doesn't debunk anything, especially because characters, again, can get stronger or weaker all the time. One of the complaints I do see is complaints against the kind of power scaling community, which I do partially agree with. I think there are absolutely insanely toxic people, and I think a lot of misinformation, and a lot of kind of side taking, where people, again, will just try and make their character as strong as possible through different arguments, rather than, you know, admitting sometimes a character can lose a fight to somebody. But the thing is that this isn't power scaling centric. It's so weird that power scaling gets attacked for having people who have favoritism, when this exists in literally any community. Spoiler alert, there are annoying and cringe and like unfun people literally in any group ever. So it's so weird that like power scalers specifically get flack for this. And I think this is kind of what sometimes happened with some of the people who have made these videos, is that they have shared a power scaling opinion and then gotten pushback by people who said, hey, you're wrong. And then maybe they even tried to debate why they think that the person wins. And again, they got pushback and maybe were presented evidence as to maybe why they were wrong. And probably they didn't like the fact that they lost that argument. And so now all power scaling is cringe and bad. And again, I think this is fine for people to respond to someone making a power scaling argument. If you say, hey, I think Goku beats Superman, I think you should be ready to have people say, well, no, here's why Superman beats Goku or whatever. There's this weird double standard where people who think they're not power scalers can still share power scaling opinions, but not expect people to then share their own opinions back. For an example of this, I wouldn't go into like the sports community, share a sports opinion, and then get mad when people say I'm wrong. That's just stupid of me. Now, the final point I want to make is that a lot of people seem to have their own perceptions of how fiction should be perceived, and that goes against how they think power scaling works. For example, someone might say, hey, this power scaling statement doesn't work because real life physics determines that it can't work, so they're not actually that strong. Again, I think probably the number one example is people who refuse to acknowledge the fact that someone in fiction might be faster than light, which is always so weird to me, because it's like, you're in fiction. Or the fact that they'll accept whatever magical fantasy properties are in that world, but the moment somebody moves a certain speed, now it's unrealistic and I don't accept it. So again, it's just like this weird double standard where the moment kind of this strength thing or speed thing comes to account, they suddenly like shut off all openness in their minds. And then there's finally just the one that I think is the funniest, where people are like, well, I've heard power scalers say how strong they think a character is, but I don't think they're that strong, so I don't really like power scaling. This one's really funny to me because that's just power scaling. You just have your own scale for that character that contradicts an individual person's scale. Because at the end of the day, power scaling isn't a monolith. It's individuals who are in a general community who like to talk about how strong they think a character is. It's so weird that it gets treated as this one big hostile group of angry power scalers who represent different communities. Now, they do exist, but for the most part, it's not like that at all. And I think unfortunately, those most vocal, most annoying, and kind of most angry, edgy power scalers are sometimes the loudest. And that's really unfortunate that this community has gotten this impression. That's pretty much all I wanted to say. I think it's clear, and I hope I've made my point clear, that power scaling is pretty important for these kinds of stories, and that ultimately, again, it is kind of just a hobby about talking about how we like to perceive fiction, and that's how we enjoy it. That's pretty much all I had to say. This was kind of an unscripted rant. I don't have enough time to write a script this week, so if you guys made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Thank you to my members who got to see this video early, and I will catch you guys in the next one. See ya.